Good evening. Welcome to the Thursday, November 10th, 2011 meeting of the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals. It's approximately 6:30. Let's go ahead and get started. This meeting is called to order. Will you call the roll, please?
Timothy Vick,
Here.
Dean Card,
Here.
Jeff Braun,
Here.
Joshua Fink, Ann Denny,
Here.
Kate Williams,
Here.
Dale Patrick,
Here.
John Dunham,
Here.
Deanna Willard.
Thank you. We do have a quorum tonight, 7 board members present. Fully constituted ZEBA board is 9 members. We have 7 present. That makes a quorum. 5 positive votes are required to pass a variance request. 5 votes being the minimum necessary to pass a motion for the board. We have no minutes for approval. Agenda item C, special order of business. Are there any disclosures tonight? Seeing no board members jumping forward with disclosures, we'll move on to agenda item D. That's the consent agenda. We have 2 resolutions for approval. Resolution number 2011-021 and resolution number 2011-022. Has everyone had a chance to review the consent agenda? Okay. Would someone please put a motion forward to approve the consent agenda? Thank you, Mr. Vig, and thank you, Mr. Patrick, for the second there. Would anybody like to pull anything from the consent agenda for discussion? Any opposition to approval of the consent agenda? Seeing none, consent agenda is approved. Don't believe that we have any appearance requests this evening. No unfinished business. Nothing on our regular agenda. That takes us to agenda item H, public hearings. And before we get started, take a brief pause here. We have another board member who's joining us. Mr. Fink, thank you.
Sorry I'm late, Mr. Chairman.
That's okay. Appreciate your attendance. Do I need to note the time, or is that okay? All right. Public hearings. For those of you that may have missed it on the way in, there are copies of the agenda as well as staff packets in the lobby. So if you'd like to follow along through the reading of the staff packet, feel free to grab one of those in the lobby. We have 3 cases before us this evening. Before we get started on that, I'd like to read the order of business for public hearings. The chair shall introduce the variance and explain the procedure to be followed. The variance case number and the name of the applicant shall be read into the record. The board shall hear and rule on any objections to the sufficiency of notice. The board shall hear a brief staff presentation outlining the variance not to exceed 10 minutes. On conclusion of that staff presentation, board members and the applicant may then direct questions to the staff through the chair. The applicant shall give his or her presentation not to exceed 10 minutes. Throughout the proceedings, the burden of proof rests upon the applicant, who must convince the board by a preponderance of the evidence that the variance should be granted. On conclusion of the applicant's presentation, the board members and the staff may then direct questions to the applicant, again through the chair. The hearing shall then be open for public testimony. Each person has 3 minutes. All persons who testify may be questioned by the board, staff, or the applicant. On conclusion of that public testimony, the staff, followed by the applicant, shall have the right of rebuttal, 3 minutes each. The board shall then proceed to develop oral findings and conclusions with regard to the variance and disposition of the variance. The staff shall reduce the oral findings and conclusions to writing for subsequent adoption by the board at a later meeting. The matter then rests with the board, and the chair asks for a positive motion from the board. Board Member Fink, before we get started, do you have any disclosures this evening?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, so let's proceed with case 2011-106. Is the petitioner Michael Hawk present? If so, please indicate so. Okay. Good evening, Mr. Hawk. Mr. Barrett, could you provide sufficiency of notice, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The property was posted with a public hearing notice sign, and it was advertised on the Muni website. We also mailed out 49 public hearing notices. We received 4 of the public hearing notices back in opposition to the case. We did not receive any comments from the Community Council.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Please proceed with your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a new type of item in a new section of the code recently added. It's a conventional yard setback, but it's a little bit different because it involves a tower in a residential district, and at the top of that tower is going to be, if approved, an electricity-generating wind turbine. And because this is something a little bit different that you don't usually find in residential zoning districts, it has some special setbacks to be applied to it. And those setbacks are the reason for the variance tonight. In your report on page 3 is a recent as-built with the proposed location of the pad and the wind tower. And you'll also notice some long rectangles. Those are existing septic fields. The reason they're in there is because the wind turbine has a separate separation distance from the septic systems as well as the yard setbacks. The septic system setbacks are not part of the variance, though. There is an older plan that Mr. Hauke had submitted earlier in the process. That's on page 17. That's really just for historical information. It's not under consideration tonight. And from pages 10 to 15, there are some photos of the property from the front showing the slope in the rear yard, the general neighborhood appearance. The property is zoned R7. The property has a minimum lot width of 120 feet, and that's important for a couple of reasons. One, because the width of the lot has an effect on your side yard lot lines, and it's also important because this property was the subject of a court-ordered replat back in 2004. In 2004, this entire subdivision and the one adjacent to it, well, they had been having problems with the plat, and over a period of years, this was worked out for the various plat problems. I don't want to get into them because they're not actually part of the case. But several of the lots in the area, many of the lots in the area, ended up being replatted by the court with a 100-foot width, even though 120 feet is the legal minimum. That is a common problem throughout the subdivision. Now, for the tower itself, its setback is not just the normal yard setbacks, but from the base of the tower at grade to the top of the most vertical pointing vane, there's a setback of 1.5 times what that height is. The tower height from base all the way to the top of a vertical vane is about 50 feet, and the setback for a tower is 1.5 times the tower's height. So the overall height is 50 feet, 1.5 times that is 75 feet. The tower has a yard setback of 75 feet. As you can see on that as-built and plot plan, the tower is about 60 feet from the rear lot line and approximately 50 feet from each side yard lot line. Now, due to the slope of the property and the septic system drain field placement, Mr. Hauke has chosen the most central location on the lot as was possible, or as is possible. The house was built in 1986. That was after the original plat in 1970, and it was after zoning was enacted, which was 1984. And as I mentioned, there was a court-ordered replat in 2004, which reduced the legal width for these R7 subdivisions from 120 feet wide down to 100 feet wide. The court-ordered replat did resolve some nonconformities that existed throughout, but it did create others, such as lot width. This lot has a rectangular shape and is over 20,000 square feet in size. That's typical in size and shape to other lots in the area. The lot is steeply sloped to the north, which is its backyard, and this is the area where the turbine would be located. This is an area of steep sloped properties. The name of the subdivision is Rabbit Creek Heights. I'm sure you're familiar with it or have been in the area. Again, the applicant's proposal is he wishes to build an electricity generating wind turbine and tower. Because of the slope in the backyard, in order to get the vanes of the generator up above the tree line and house line of adjacent properties, he's requesting a height that causes him to violate the yard setback. These towers have an overall height limit of 95 feet, but that is further restricted by the yard setback of 1.5 times the height of the tower. So in this case, the yard setback is 75 feet. And since the lot's only 100 feet wide, it's obviously physically impossible for Mr. Hauke to meet the setbacks. Even if the lot had the 120-foot legal width, the setbacks could still not be met. He would be requesting a smaller variance, but just the built-in width of the lot means that a tower of the height Mr. Hauke is requesting, he's going to need a variance. So as to the findings, in Standard 1, that there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances, that standard is partially met. The lot is steeply sloped on the north side, which is Mr. Hauke's backyard and which is where the tower would go, and that is what generates his desire for a taller than normal tower taller than normal. Standard 1, the standard is only partially met because these steep slopes are common throughout the neighborhood, so it is not a truly unique character of Mr. Hauke's property. Standard number 2, because of the physical circumstances, strict application would create an exceptional hardship and deprive the applicant of common rights of enjoyment. This standard is not substantially met. Yes, there are definite physical problems with the property, but the denial of the variance does not create an undue hardship nor deprive the applicant of common rights of property enjoyment. The wind turbine is an admirable undertaking, but the common right of enjoyment in the R7 district is for a home similar to the home that Mr. Hauke has and the other homes that exist in the area now. Standard 3, that the hardship is not self-imposed. The standard is partially met. The first part of that standard is regarding the physical defects to the property, and yes, it is steeply sloped. However, the second part of the standard, the need for the variance, does appear to be a result of the actions of the applicant. Mr. Hauke wishes a tower taller than allowed by code in order to increase the efficiency of the device. A shorter tower is possible, although it may not function as well or as efficiently. The standard is partially met because this is not completely Mr. Hauke's fault. This is an unusual ordinance for wind towers. The applicant for a wind tower, or excuse me, a wind turbine has two choices. He can have a roof-mounted turbine or he can have a freestanding one. Mr. Hauke's original choice was to put it on the roof. In this ordinance, the neighbors have the right to veto the location. So Mr. Hauke moved it from the roof of his house to a tower in the backyard, and that's what presents him with the setback variance. Standard 4, the variance, if granted, will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. The standard is partially met. There are no structure separation violations, no drainage or runoff issue. However, the neighbors are concerned about visual pollution and noise pollution, which is why this standard is only partially met. Standard 5, the variance, if granted, is in keeping with the intent of the code. The standard is partially met. The requested variance is dimensional. The setback reduction does not change the character of the zoning district, but because the variance involves a tower with a large propeller sitting on top of it, it is possible, if this were to become common in the area, that it might resemble more of an industrial use rather than a residential use. And I want to be clear, this is purely a residential tower for Mr. Hauke's own electricity generation. Standard 6, the variance does not affect the wider area of the municipality of Anchorage in regard to health, safety, and welfare. That standard is substantially met. As in Standard 4, no issues have been identified, no municipal agency has objected, and if the variance is approved, Mr. Hauke will be moving on to the next step in the process, which is the site plan approval. And finally, for Standard 7, the variance granted is the minimum variance to make possible a reasonable use of the land. That standard is not substantially met. A reasonable use of the land is for the home as it currently exists. There are not many homes in this area of Upper Rabbit Creek. The subject house is older than most, but it is comparable in size to most of the other homes in the area. A minimum variance might include a shorter tower, which may not be as efficient in terms of power generation, but it might possibly then meet the yard setback. And in order for it to do that, the tower would have to be about 33.5 feet tall. 33.5 feet tall for the tower times the 1.5 setback would bring the setback in at just under 50 feet. So theoretically, it would be possible to fit it on the property with a fairly short tower. Because these standards are not substantially met, the department recommends denial. If the board should find for approval, we have conditions on page 9. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Do any board members have questions for staff? Mr. Dunham.
Yes, Mr. Barrett, I may have missed this in your discussion, but when was that ordinance passed, 2145-410?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Dunham, the ordinance amended and approved, dated by the clerk's office, August 31st, 2010.
Thank you.
Any other board member questions for staff? Mr. Fink.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barrett, if you could, you had indicated that the ordinance provided neighbors the right to veto a rooftop turbine, but they have no such veto with regard to the freestanding?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Fink, yes, they do. The neighbors in the ordinance, the way it's worded, if I can just summarize, an applicant, in order to get approval, whether it's roof-mounted or freestanding, must have a simple majority of all of his abutting neighbors vote for his proposal. Mr. Hauke's case, he has 5 neighbors, 5 people with whom he shares a property line. He'll need 3 of those neighbors to support his case, and it applies whether it's rooftop or freestanding.
And if I can follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Certainly.
Didn't you indicate that they did veto the rooftop turbine?
Yes, sir.
That they have not done so with regard to the freestanding tower?
That's correct, Mr. Fink. Because of the process, when it was rooftop mounted, no variance was needed. Mr. Hauke submitted, the neighbors vetoed it. When he moved to the backyard, the need for the variance became apparent. Variance comes first, then the site plan, then the neighborhood.
I think you answered my question,
All right.
just so I understand the process then.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So even if we were to approve the variance, it's still subject to a veto by his neighbors?
Yes, sir.
And does the department have any indication that the neighbors are less opposed to a freestanding tower than the rooftop tower? It doesn't look like it from the packet.
No, sir. There's no indication that they are less opposed.
Thank you.
Any other questions by the board for staff? Okay. Seeing none, if the applicant could please come forward, please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to present my case. My first name is Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L. My last name is Hauke, H-A-U-K-E.
Good evening again, Mr. Hauke. You'll have 10 minutes for your presentation, and I respectfully ask that you speak to the 7 standards that Mr. Barrett just walked us through.
Thank you. I would first like to talk about my motivation why I would like to build this turbine. I have a pretty strong background in renewable energies. I come from Germany, and we have about 40,000 wind turbines there. As far as I know, nobody got hurt or killed by any of those wind turbines. I would like to make a positive contribution, a positive difference in Alaska's energy landscape. I would like this to be a pilot project. I understand I'm the first one to approach this difficult path to get a permit. But I'm willing to do that because I think it will help streamlining the application process for future applicants. First, I would like to talk about some public comments that I read. I won't spend much time on it, but I really want you to be aware that I took great concern of those public comments. And one common concern was reducing the property value. Neighbors are concerned that the property value will decrease. I think it will not be the case because it will have a wind turbine will give the property a green image. It will give the subdivision a green image as well. It's also a safety feature for those common power outages we have to deal with in Bear Valley. Yeah, I'm planning on using it. I'm planning on using the turbine together with a battery bank. Excuse me. Also, Jukic Electric, our electricity provider, does allow customers to sell energy back into the grid. They just issued an application to make this possible, so you can offset your electricity cost and make a positive environmental impact. The noise issue. Some common neighborhood noises that we have to deal with in the neighborhood are large trucks, SUVs, snow machines, four-wheelers, and lots of dogs. I don't contribute to any of it, but some concern was raised on how noisy that new wind turbine is going to be. And the wind characteristic of the turbine is quite different from other noise sources. It will be absolutely silent throughout the majority of the year when there is no wind or not enough to get the wind turbine started. Only on windy days it will put out about 48 dB, which is measured 50 feet from the wind generator at 12 miles per hour gusting wind. Now this is compared to a background noise. Whenever the wind picks up, it's going to be noisier in the environment because the wind brushes over the houses and the trees. So you're not going to hear very much the wind turbine. You will hear the background noise. The background noise is expected to be 46 decibel at 12 miles per hour. Also, the wind turbine being up high is going to be 80 feet away from the nearest property line. That is looking at the person standing at the property line. So the noise will be further reduced based on that. And the third item was the visibility issues. Yes, wind turbines are visible. I don't know any other design way to install a wind turbine and make it completely disappear. Wind turbines need to be exposed so that they actually function. I'll speak more about that later. There's also the safety measure. I'm trying to make this a state-of-the-art project. I'm thinking about, if it gets approved, I'm thinking about spending the extra money on a tilled-up hydraulic tower, which will enable me to take the turbine down for maintenance and inspection. Oh yeah, sorry, back to the visibility. There's also some annoying visibility aspects in Bear Valley, such as car wrecks, some old vehicle tires, parked boats, heavy-duty abandoned construction equipment, unfinished houses, blue tarp roofs, abandoned houses. All this we have to deal with. And I think this is a lot more disturbing than looking at one single wind turbine. Now when you look at it, it will mostly be covered by the tree line because the trees in my neighborhood are 40 to 50 feet high. My house on this side of the property is about 37 feet high. So there won't be much of the turbine sticking out. In fact, you will only see half of a blade, the wind turbine blade. You won't even see the tower because the tower is only 37 feet high. I'm thinking about using a 50 feet tower height. How did I get there? Because it's really impossible to get any power out of a wind turbine that's covered by obstacle, that's covered by trees or covered by my home structure. So if I were to go with the 33 feet that I am allowed based on the Municipality of Anchorage wind ordinance, I could possibly install a 1 kW wind turbine, and it being entirely covered by the 40 feet high trees, I don't think if I get any, I might get a couple hundred watts out of it, and this would make this project not worthwhile doing. It would not only decrease the efficiency, it would make it an impossible project. That's why I'm pushing so hard for the 50 feet tower height to make this work. Now I would like to, at the end, I would like to talk briefly about the wind ordinance and variance. In the beginning of the wind ordinance, it does say this is to encourage small wind turbine development. And after spending weekends and weekends and issuing 60 copies of my application, I feel slightly discouraged where this, I'm uncertain whether it can even be done. Trying to comply with all the requirements of the wind ordinance and of the variance. Especially giving the public the right to veto this project makes it very difficult. If I had the right to veto the construction of a two-story structure at my neighbor's lot, would I do it? I probably would say no, you can't do it because it obstructs my view. It annoys me. I don't want you to do it. I don't know of any people who would sign a legal consent agreement that they have nothing whatsoever against the construction of a wind turbine tower. It's really hard to get a permit that way.
You do have just over a minute left, Mr. Hauke. If you'd like to reserve that time for rebuttal, you can do so. If not,
I'm almost done. I tried to respond to those 7 questions in my application. The first 3 questions, however, are really hard to answer because they don't really address the main issue, which is the setback requirement. Question 1 does say property needs to have an ordinary physical circumstances. That is the case. My lot has a steep slope. The foundation of the wind turbine will likely be 12 feet below the house's foundation. It's also a very narrow lot, and I can make a case there, but I don't understand how this relates to the setback requirements of the wind ordinance. Question 2, conforming with code will create exceptional hardship. That's also hard to justify with the wind turbine. It will be really hard to get it to make a point on this one. Same with the third question. Hardship is not self-imposed. This question does not address the main issue, the setback requirements enforced by the ordinance. It lacks giving the applicant the chance to explain why conforming with the setback requirements, this project cannot be realized.
Mr. Hauke, your time has expired.
Thank you, I'm done. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. If you could please stay at the podium. Chances are you may be asked some questions about your presentation and also about the standards. Do any board members have questions for the applicant? Mr. Fink.
Were there any brief comments you had, Mr. Hulk, with regard to the standards that you'd want to finish? I'm asking you a question, I guess, to give you an opportunity to close up with any comments you had on the standards you didn't get to, any pertinent points.
Are you talking about the 7 questions?
Yes. Yes. And I think you covered the first 3.
Sure, we can go through the questions. The first question was, I think I already answered the first question. The extraordinary physical circumstances are that my lot has a steep slope, about 13%, and that if I build a 33-feet tower, it would likely be covered entirely by the trees and the house in front of it. Number 2, confirming with code will create exceptional hardship on the property owner. This variance is needed to benefit from the wind ordinance with setback requirements for this land use area, residential zone of 1.5 tower height. Only a 33-foot tower could be built on this narrow lot. And again, a 33-foot tower would make this project impossible to do. Number 3, hardship is not self-imposed, and special conditions and circumstances do not result from any actions of the applicant, and such conditions and circumstances do not merely constitute inconvenience. Again, this is really hard to answer. The original design included roof-mounted, you have already heard the process, that my neighbors vetoed the roof-mounted wind turbine, and I changed my design to come to an agreement with the neighbors. So the design now includes a wind turbine tower in the backyard. Question 4, the variance granted does not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. Neighbors are, the neighbors are very much concerned about the noise and the visual pollution, which I already talked about under public comments. Again, the wind turbine will be mostly covered by the 40 feet tree line. But if you stand right in front of it, yes, you're going to see it. And it's really hard to make it entirely disappear. However, I don't think it's going to change the nature of the subdivision. It's just one single structure. It's really hard to see even on a clear day. Most of the days there we have pretty good fog and clouds, and if the color is picked right, the wind turbine will blend in nicely, will not stick out. Number 5, variance if granted does not change the character of zoning district. It does not. It would be different if it was a 100-foot tower, but I'm only asking for 50 feet. Number 6, variance if granted does not have health, safety, and welfare aspects. No, it does not. Again, I'm trying to make it a safe project. I will also consult, if granted, I will consult with a structural engineer to make sure the necessary reinforcements are provided for the wind turbine tower. I'm aware that there are high wind gusts in our area. I used to work for an environmental company, and I put up wind monitoring towers. I am aware of the wind speeds in Bear Valley. However, most manufacturers, I have not found a single one that doesn't, do rate their wind turbines based on the maximum speed, not on the wind gust. So that's what I would build it based on. I would take the maximum wind speed that I can find based on data available, and I would make sure that my wind turbine can withstand that maximum wind speed. Last question. Question 7, variance, if granted, is the minimum variance that make a possible, that will make possible a reasonable use of land. Again, I don't think this wind turbine will change the nature of the subdivision. I believe it will make a positive change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chalker. Do any other, Mr. Fink, does that answer? Okay. Any other board members have questions? Ms. Denny.
Yes, Mr. Houka, you'd mentioned earlier about selling bulk unused power back to the municipality, to Chugiak. The system that you're planning to install, do you expect to have a surplus? And if so, why couldn't you go with a smaller system?
To your first question, I do have a battery bank, and so it's really up to me, but I want to save the surplus in the battery bank and use it for my house when there are no windy days available. I guess I would leave it up to how much surplus there really is. If my battery bank is fully charged, I would then sell it back to Jukic Electric. It works like a net metering. So if you produce more energy than you use, then your meter would turn backward, and you would then, if you really have a surplus, you would then have a lower utility cost at the end of the month. But again, this is not the idea behind this project. I will certainly pay more money for installing the system than I will be getting out of the savings. It has a different idea behind it. I really want to make a difference. I want to make this a greener subdivision, so the money on cost savings for the energy is not really the driving factor. And sorry, what was the second question? The second comment? I forgot.
If you plan on having a surplus or being able to store energy in a battery bank, wouldn't a smaller system work just as well?
A smaller system would only work if there wouldn't be any obstructions. If this was a treeless subdivision, I could probably install a 33-foot tower. If my house was the only one on this area, like this right now, there's not too many houses, it could probably be done. But with the tree line being at 40 to 50 feet, it's not possible to install any turbine lower than the tree is. It would be hard to produce anything. Most design guides for wind turbines suggest that you are above, that you are 15 to 20 feet above any obstructions, be it could be trees, it could be houses, light poles, whatever it is, just to, not only for the efficiency, but also to keep the maintenance down on the maintenance time low on the wind generator. Because the more you are within the disturbed zone, the less likely you will get a consistent wind, and the less efficient the wind turbine will work. Thank you. Any other questions?
Any other board members have questions? Mr. Vig.
Mr. Hauke, if the intent isn't to unplug from the grid, but to make a difference, then why wind? Why not photovoltaic panels on your roof or something else that would be less intrusive?
I've been looking into all kinds of renewable sources, and I looked into ground source heat pumps, and it turned out that installing them would cost more than running my boiler, so I couldn't really make this a pilot project. However, I did install photovoltaic collectors, and I also installed a solar thermal collector for hot water heating. Those systems only work in the summertime. Why? Because my lot is on a north side of on the south side of a mountain. Therefore, I don't have any direct sun between October and March. If it was on the other side, or if there was no direct obstruction from the sun, yes, I could be using solar energy throughout the entire year. But it's only available during summer.
Thank you.
Mr. Patrick.
Hey, Mr. Hauke, you had mentioned you had a structural engineer look at this. I'm a little concerned about the tip distances. What kind of wind loading is that tower designed for? Because you're in a high wind area.
Right now it's designed for 65 miles per hour. And again, most manufacturers do rate their towers on a standard maximum wind speed, not on the wind gusts. And some manufacturers do offer upgrades for high wind areas. And then structural engineers will do the calculation whether the tower will withstand high winds.
Yes, Mr. Patrick.
Do you know what the wind is up there? How fast it blows through there?
There is not really a measuring tower. It's all the data that's been collected. It's mostly all the data that's been made public information are mostly estimates from other stations. There's no wind tower I know of in Bear Valley. I do suspect that wind speeds can pick up to 70. Wind gusts perhaps can pick up to 75 miles per hour. Again, those wind gusts really don't hold on for more than a second or two, so you wouldn't design a structure for it. You would design it for the maximum continuous wind speed, which I think is less than 75 miles per hour. I will keep researching and trying to find an accurate number for this area. So many guesses have been made about how high the wind gusts can be on a bad day, and there's just no accurate source for those numbers.
Thank you, Mr. Hauke.
Any other board member questions for Mr. Hauke? Okay. Seeing none, Mr. Barrett, do you have any questions?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Thank you, Mr. Hauke. If you could have a seat, we'll open the hearing up to public testimony now.
Thank you very much.
If there's anyone from the public wishing to testify in this case, please come forward. Please state your name, spell your last name for the record.
Good evening. My name is Michael Haukedalen, Haukedalen, and that's correct through a very bizarre quirk of circumstance. Mr. Hauke and I have virtually the same name, except my name is a little bit longer. That's led to some confusion, so I'm happy to spell that out right at the beginning.
Thank you, Mr. Hauke-Dahlen. You'll have 3 minutes for your
Thank you.
testimony.
I'm here with my spouse, Leslie Murkey. Leslie is the owner of record of our residence, which is at 7940 Susan Circle. We are directly across the road and uphill from Mr. Hauke. We're also the owners of a empty plot, which is due east of Mr. Hauke's land, and as such, we are adjacent abutters as strictly defined by the Planning Department. I would like to also add that we consider the petitioner, Mr. Hauke, a very good neighbor and an asset to the neighborhood. We consider this a very admirable project, but along with the majority of our neighbors, virtually every neighbor that I've spoken with, we think this is in the wrong location. Therefore, we strongly oppose granting the variance for 3 reasons. Those are aesthetic, safety, and financial concerns. The aesthetic concerns are visual and noise pollution that have been alluded to already that will adversely affect the pleasure and enjoyment of our property. We purchased our house, like most people do, for the beautiful views. A 50-foot tower topped with a 20-foot diameter propeller, and I want to emphasize this is not a little propeller. It's 20 feet in diameter, and it's spinning, will completely obscure the views from our home of Denali, the inlet, and the city lights. That's specific to us. We live uphill. However, because we all enjoy amazing views in virtually every direction in our neighborhood, the other properties will be similarly affected to one extent or another. We're also concerned about noise. Mr. Hauke has cited some 48 decibel threshold limit at 11 miles an hour, which is just below what's allowed by the municipal ordinance. 11 miles an hour winds are not typical where we live when it's going to be windy, and I can only imagine, unless it's designed to shut down at 11 miles an hour, my understanding is that noise goes up exponentially above that. The wind speeds are a big concern up there, and that brings me to the safety concerns that we share. Bear Valley gets very frequent high winds. I did some research on the turbine, which is cited in the application, and I found online, not in the materials that were presented in the report, but online, the exact same manufacturer turbine model cites a survival speed for this turbine of 50 meters per second, which is 110 miles an hour. Now, survival speed is a term of art that's used in the turbine business. It's not a safety speed or a shut-off speed. It's called survival. I didn't see anything, again, in the documentation about that, so I did some research, and in a very elaborate Wikipedia article, the quote is, all wind turbines are designed for a maximum wind speed called survival speed, above which they do not survive. Now, the Bear Valley winds are notorious. I have some neighbors who are a husband and wife couple who are commercial pilots with over 20 years of flying experience. Is that my time?
It is. If you could wrap up, please.
Okay. They cited typical speeds. We get 60 to 70 miles an hour winds monthly, 100 plus 3 or 4 times a year. They've recorded 122 maximum speeds, and also one of our other neighbors who's a commercial pilot has cited 140 at his land. I do have some information that I'd like to introduce into the record from 2 real estate professionals who say that this absolutely will have a financial impact on our property values in Bear Valley, 2 separate people.
Okay. If in concluding you could bring that forward to Jill, we'll need to keep it in the record for 30 days.
Yes. I've also got, if I may, 2 neighbors who are unable to attend that I'd like to, or at least one I'd like to enter into the record, his formal letter of disapproval. He is an adjacent abutting landowner, and that brings to 4 out of 5 adjacent abutting landowners who are on record as being in opposition to the tower as well.
Okay. Please bring that forward. Thank you. Do any board members have questions for Mr. Hauke-Dahlen? Mr. Barrett?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony.
Thank you.
Sure. Good. Is there anyone else from the public wishing to testify in this case? Okay, seeing none. With that, the public hearing is closed, and I believe the matter now should rest with the board. Rebuttal from staff?
Nothing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Unless there's opposition to requesting a motion, if a board member could please put forward a positive motion in the case. Thank you, Mr. Fink. Please state your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd move that the Commission grant a variance from AMC 2145-410 to allow the height of a wind-powered electrical generation tower to encroach the yard setback, the freestanding, sorry, let me make sure I've got the right language. Well, I'd move a variance, as just stated, with the conditions set in staff's recommendations on page 8 and 9.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. And Mr. Kars, was that second yours? Okay, thank you. Mr. Fink, would you like to speak to your motion?
I will, and I'm, yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I admire what the applicant is trying to do, quite a bit, actually, but I don't believe I'm going to support this motion. I can't support what he's trying to do at the expense of the character of the neighborhood and the zoning law or the safety. Though, again, I do admire what he's trying to do. I've read the staff packet, heard staff's presentation, and I would just by reference adopt their reasoning and findings. The standards aren't met, so I'm not going to be able to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Mr. Kars, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd also echo Mr. Fink's comments, and I do agree. I think sounds like the petitioner is somewhat of the guinea pig with this ordinance, and I believe he's put a lot of time and effort into this application and this endeavor, and further concur with the petitioner's contention that if this ordinance is to encourage the construction of wind turbines, it sure doesn't seem like getting property owners' concurrence is a very easy task in order to encourage their construction. But I assume that requirement was put in place for a specific reason. I think this is contentious, and people have their opinions with respect to the presence of wind turbine. I think there's been a lot of effort put into the application, and I concur with, I believe, staff and some other comments that I've read that this is an admirable endeavor, but that this, it comes down to this lot, because of its size, just may not be suitable for a wind turbine in this residential area. And the height and setback ratios seem to have been established to avoid just this issue. So I do not feel that standard, specifically 1, 2, or 3 have been met. And concur with staff's findings on standards 4, that they are partially met, although we have heard from the neighbors about concern regarding the visual and noise pollution. Do find that standard 5 is met. Standard 6 is met. I do not find that standard 7 is met. So for those reasons, I do not intend to support the motion, but again, would like to offer to the applicant, I do appreciate the amount of effort that's been put into this application.
Thank you, Mr. Kars. Any other board members like to speak to the motion? I'll add my comments just briefly. I'll concur with Mr. Fink's statement about this being an admirable endeavor. And And again, appreciate the applicant's diligence in trying to work through the process. As Board Member Carr has pointed out, the lot just doesn't appear to be suitable for the size of the endeavor that's proposed. This being the first wind tower case, it's caused me to look slightly differently at Standard 2 and what really is entitled or meant by common rights of enjoyment for land, whether or not that should extend beyond a home in terms of harnessing a renewable resource like wind. That said, I still don't find that the other standards are substantially met, especially Standard 7, and do not intend to support the motion. With that, pending any other comments, let's vote. That motion fails with 8 nay votes. I must read for the record, every final decision of the board shall clearly state on its face it is a final decision with respect to all issues involved in the case, and that the parties have 30 days from the date of mailing or other distribution of the decision to file an appeal to the Superior Court. Again, thank you. All right, let's move on to our second case for the evening. It's case number 2011-124. Is the petitioner Jerome and or Wanda Dahl or the representatives present this evening? They've indicated they are. Thank you. Mr. McLaughlin, is this your case?
Yes, it is.
All right, if you could please provide sufficiency of notice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There were 147 public hearing notices that were mailed to the public, and also the application was given to the Northeast Community Council. The Community Council did not respond. There was one response, one public hearing notice that was sent back to the Planning Department in favor of the granting of the variance. There were the petitioner provided 6 letters of support from neighbors in the neighborhood, and 2 more comments were received late. They are attached separately. One supports the granting of the variances, and the other one objects. It appears that he objects to the front yard encroachment. The late comments are in that separate sheet that I'm holding up. That's all.
Thank you. When you're ready, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Page 8 of the packet shows an as-built. Also, pages 45 to 47 show photos of the garage and the shed, so you can see what the site looks like. The petitioner is requesting a variance from minimum yard requirements for the front yard setback for a 2-car garage to encroach 1.3 feet or 6.5% into the 20-foot front yard setback in the R2M district. An administrative variance can be granted from the Planning Department for a tolerance of 0.9 feet. This is 1.3 feet, just a little bit beyond what can be granted administratively. Therefore, the variance request is before the board tonight. Also, the petitioner has built a greenhouse in the backyard that is approximately 3 feet from the deck in the backyard and approximately 4 feet from the house. The regulations say that any structure has to be 10 feet. There has to be a 10-foot separation. Standard number 1, the standard does not appear to be met for the garage or the greenhouse. Essentially, there's no exceptional physical circumstance of the land. Additionally, the lot is about 1,000 square feet larger than the minimum required for that zoning district. Standard number 2, the standard is not met for the garage or the greenhouse. The petitioner had sufficient space to build a garage in the front yard and still maintain that 20-foot front yard setback. You can see photos of other garages in the neighborhood on page 48 of the packet. In regards to the greenhouse and that 10-foot separation, there's sufficient space to build a 100-square-foot greenhouse in the rear yard as well. Standard number 3, the standard is not met, does not appear to be met for the garage or the greenhouse. There's no peculiarity of the lot. The lot's essentially the same as others in the same zoning district. The garage, the need for the variance is a result of the petitioner's, in terms of the garage, the need for the variance is a result of the petitioner's desire to keep the existing garage. A building permit was issued, and the garage was built larger than what was approved by the plans. The greenhouse didn't need a building permit because it's under 150 square feet, and it's a very nice greenhouse, but because they didn't need to get a building permit, they probably weren't aware of this 10-foot separation distance that's needed, unfortunately. So again, it's the result of the petitioner's desire to keep the structure in its current location. And he believes that it would be difficult to move it, or they would have to dismantle it. Standard number 4 is met for the garage and the greenhouse. The variances will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property because they are in the front yard and in the backyard, and this wouldn't create a problem to the properties to the east and to the west and to the south. Standard number 5 is also met for both the garage and the greenhouse. The requested variances are dimensional and not use variances. Standard number 6 is met for the garage and is substantially met for the greenhouse. In terms of the garage, it's not going to create a fire separation issue. There were several people who have commented, public comments, in support of the granting of the variances. There was one person who opposed to this a small variance for the garage in the front yard, but they didn't provide a justification. In terms of the greenhouse, I'll just read from what I have in the report here. The variance for the greenhouse creates a fire separation issue. The greenhouse is not fire rated, and the space for firemen to attack fires is tight. However, the greenhouse is not hooked up to electricity and does not appear to, and there does appear to be sufficient space for fire access. Fire plan review commented, they stated, the fire plan review, Tom Furch, commented, I have no code path objecting to the greenhouse as it is an accessory structure for a single-family house, which is not regulated by the International Fire Code. It is small enough in area, only 100 square foot, 10 by 10. It does, that was me ad-libbing there, begin the quote again, that it does not require a building permit under the building code. So fire does not appear to have a problem with it. Therefore, we've found that it's substantially met. The last standard, Standard 7, is partially met for the garage and it appears to not be met for the greenhouse. The two-car garage can be built on the property without encroaching in the front yard setback. However, a 6.5% encroachment in a 20-foot front yard setback appears to be minor. It can be considered the encroachment as de minimis. For the greenhouse, the encroachment is also considered de minimis. It's not noticeable, and it doesn't appear to be a health and safety issue. The department finds that standards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7 are not substantially met for the garage and the greenhouse, and therefore must recommend denial of both variances. If after the public hearing the board finds that all 7 standards are substantially met for either variance, then they should be subject to conditions 1 through 4 on page 7. Just make one change that I guess conditions 1 and 2 state that the variance should be granted. So if you granted one variance but not the other, then we may have to knock out one of those standards. That's all I have. I'd be happy to expand on any of these standards. I tried to be brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. Appreciate that. Mr. Cars.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple questions. Mr. McLaughlin, standard, or on page 7, Conditions 1 and 2 reference a survey prepared by Ken Lang and dated January 1st, or January 18th, 2011. On page 8 of the packet, the as-built is done by Robert Johns. Can you clarify where the Ken Lang survey is, or what needs to change?
That's a copy and paste. Through the chair, Mr. Cars, I apologize for my mistake. The surveyor is Robert Johns. I'm taking a quick look at this, and it appears that I got everything else right except for the name of the surveyor.
The date? The date is the date as shown on page 8. Is that correct?
No, the date of the survey, that's also an error. So the name of the surveyor and the date are not correct. It should be subject to the as-built on page 8. There's no other as-built. I just used a different cases to copy and paste to have the right sort of wording and wording order, and those are two errors. I'm sorry.
Okay. And through the chair?
Go ahead, Mr. Cars.
And I was looking for a little bit more background that we typically find on our cases. Was this you kind of flew by that there was a building permit. Was there an existing house? Is this a new house and garage? What's happening here?
Sure. Through the chair, Mr. Cars, you're correct. There's no property history in this. The subdivision, I'll have to look and see if I attached the plat. It doesn't appear that I did. I think that the subdivision is from the 70s, and that the house was built within 2 years of the subdividing of the creation of the subdivision. So the house was built very similar, the same as other houses on the block. They applied for a building permit about 10 years ago, and the building permit was approved. Then they sought to change the approved site plan, and that changed site plan, they went and got structural review to sign that they were in support of it, and they took that as approval from zoning, that it met the yard setbacks and that it was sort of the new approved site plan. It was not, and it was built according to the site plan that they thought was approved and not the one that actually was approved. And then they never obtained a final certificate of occupancy. There was no closeout inspection, and it just lingered all this time until the family is seeking to sell the property and move out of state. And it was discovered at the day of closing at the table when they were trying to complete the sale. That's what I understand to be the case.
Any other questions by board members for Mr. McLaughlin? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. McLaughlin. Proceed with the petitioner. Please state your name, spell your last name for the record.
My name is Reed Moore, R-E-E-D-M-O-O-R-E. First of all, I wanted to thank you guys for your time tonight. I know that it's a cold evening. You'd probably rather be home. And I also want to thank Mr. McLaughlin for his hard work preparing the staff comments on this. I would like to take the last 2 minutes, if I may, to save for rebuttal, and I want to take about 8 minutes of your time to talk to you about why we believe all 7 standards are substantially met. We find that standard 1 is substantially met, and before the addition of the drive and the new driveway, the lot actually sits on kind of a hill in the neighborhood. However, before it was changed, the grading was such that it created kind of a small lake at the very top of the subdivision. There was an indentation that was just to the east of the property. So whenever there was a large rain or of course, spring breakup, what would happen is all of the snow that piled up from all the neighbors would actually pool right at the very top of the area. And so the changes that were made to the property remedied this substantially for the whole neighborhood. The property was actually not originally built with a garage, which was atypical for the neighborhood. The vast majority of the neighborhood houses do have garages, and we think it's it's a reasonable addition to the property, especially for an elderly Alaskan couple, which Mrs. and the late Jerry Dahl were. The size of the garage it's standard for this size of home as well as for the neighborhood. In reference to the greenhouse, we find that the standard is substantially met as well. To move the greenhouse, which has been in existence for many, many years, would really cause it to have to be torn down in its entirety. In driving through the neighborhood and looking at other neighborhood houses, when I looked at the corridor of homes that were specifically between 11th and 12th Avenue only, which constitutes about 25 homes, out of the 25 homes, through an aerial picture as well as a drive-by, there appear to be about 20 like-in-kind structures in the neighboring homes, of which I could count 15 that were actually built in the easements and the setbacks of those lots. Now, that's not, of course, to get any of the neighbors in trouble. This is one of about 5 additional buildings in this corridor that actually is built outside of the setbacks. We believe that standard number 2 is substantially met. And in the addition of the garage was built with the understanding that it actually was approved by the municipality of Anchorage, as referenced in pages 24 through 29 of the staff's findings. The owners constructed the garage and believed that they were following all of the required steps that were put to them to the best of their knowledge. It came to a shock to them and to the rest of us that there was another step that was needed that they were not made aware of at the time. They invested a significant amount of financial resources to do this remodel. We also found that the greenhouse substantially meets standard 2 as well. The greenhouse is located on the only part of the property that could be located, unlike most outbuildings in the area, as I referenced before. It's not built in the easement. It's not built in one of the setbacks. And the reason for this specific building code that the staff believes it does not meet the standard of is only for fire purposes. And as the staff commented in their own report, the fire department, as referenced in the staff findings, page 6 states this, and I quote, "There appears to be sufficient space for fire access. And again, I have no code path objecting to the greenhouse, as it is an accessory structure, and the structure is small enough not to need a building permit." So this particular structure was located where it was actually to be outside of the setbacks and easements, and the fire department has no objections to it being in its current location. As to exceptional and undue hardship, this is the current situation that we're in right now. The late Jerry Dahl actually passed away within about a week of us finding out this information. It was somewhat unexpected. And his widow's in a situation right now where the homeowners, the soon-to-be homeowners, have graciously moved into the property and are paying enough money to keep the property from going into foreclosure. Wanda Dahl is not a woman of great means. She has moved down with family in Washington after her husband passed away. The situation really is that if these variances are not granted, the house, we don't see any other path but foreclosure for the property. She doesn't have the means to maintain the property. In order for the garage to be changed, it's a substantial change for 1.3 feet. And because of the lack of proceeds from the sale of the house, as well as the fact that the garage has an inflow radiant heat, it's a sizable amount of money to make that small change. We believe that Standard 3 has been substantially met as well. The building of the garage and the remodel of the home, as previously mentioned, were a result of a good faith effort on the part of the Dahls to obtain approval from the municipality of Anchorage on their proposed plans. The Dahls followed the proper process, and my understanding is that it was a mix-up in the permitting department which led the owners to believe that the permit was indeed closed out. They were under this assumption, and the garage has been in existence on the property for 8 years and it has never been an issue. To make a change, like I said, to the garage would cause the property to go into foreclosure. The challenge with this property going into foreclosure is because of the nature of the change that would be needed. A bank foreclosing on it would not go through the necessary changes themselves, and I know that because I'm a real estate professional. And what would happen is the property would have to be sold at a substantial loss to the bank by a cash investor, and that would affect adversely not only the seller, not only the buyer, but the neighborhood as well. We find we agree with the staff on standards 4, 5, and 6, and we believe that standard 7 is substantially met for both the garage and the greenhouse. The garage is of standard size for the area, and the 1.3 foot encroachment is not apparent to the eye. In fact, it actually is 20 full feet from the existing curb as well. Likewise, the greenhouse is situated in the only part of the property that it's able to be situated in. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. You have about a minute left for rebuttal. Do any board members have questions for Mr. Moore? I do have one question, Mr. Moore. What's the current status of the property? Is it occupied? Is it?
It's being graciously occupied by the potential new buyers. Mm-hmm.
Ms. Denny.
My question's regarding the greenhouse. Having to move or demolish the greenhouse, would that be a stopping point in the sale? If we couldn't pass it because of those two, if we had to separate them and we couldn't find a reason to approve it for the greenhouse, would that stop the sale?
We would figure out a way to make it happen as a result of the greenhouse. It's not as terminal. Again, going back to the purpose for the building code is for fire safety, and the fire department did not find that it created a problem for them.
Board Member Vig.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, you mentioned that there's in-floor heat in the garage, and is there a boiler system that's in the garage that provides that in-floor heat?
It's one boiler system for the entire property, yes.
Okay. Is that a possible reason why the garage is maybe slightly longer or accommodates larger vehicles, is that it also has this boiler in there, or is there a connection between those two circumstances?
No, sir. The reason for the garage being the size it was is based on the as-built survey, the old as-built survey in this package. It showed that the plans were approved and that it did have a 20-foot setback.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other board member questions for Mr. Moore? Okay. Mr. McLaughlin?
No, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Moore. If you'd have a seat, we'll open it up for public testimony. And again, you have a minute left for rebuttal. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify in this case? Okay. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Sherilyn Cunningham, Cunningham.
Good evening, Ms. Cunningham. You'll have 3 minutes for your testimony.
I just wanted to say good evening, and my husband and I are the hopeful buyers, and I just wanted to kind of put in the minds of the members, if you were the day of closing on a new house, and that was the day you found out it wasn't as far as you thought it was from the road, as we drive around the neighborhood, I know I'm not very good at visual judgment of distance. However, it seems similar to many of the houses in the neighborhood. There are some that are farther back, but there's also some that appear just as close, if not closer. And if you look at the pictures of the house, it is a very beautiful house. And in reference to the greenhouse, listening to the distances that they would like it to be from the house, I was just thinking, again, I'm not great with visual distances, but to move it an additional 10 feet would then be putting it too close to our neighbors, our hopeful neighbors. So even though it would be difficult to move, I think moving it would then be adversely affecting our neighbors, because then it would be in their view and in the easements. So that's why I would like to recommend approval.
Thank you, Ms. Cunningham. Board members have any questions for Ms. Cunningham? Mr. McLaughlin?
No, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any other members of the public that would like to testify? Okay, seeing no one. Mr. Moore, you do have a minute if you'd like to rebut anything that was testified to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The one comment that I did have was there was one public objection. And in reading the public objection, it looks pretty clear to me that the person was confused as to what they were indeed objecting to. It looked like they didn't actually have an idea of what the notice was sent out for. And so hopefully that would be taken in consideration. And again, the situation is such that 1.3 feet, especially on the garage, is a fairly significant amount. And the changes to the neighborhood, the effect of this on the seller and the buyer would, I believe, be substantial. So thank you again for considering this, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any final questions by board members? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Thanks.
With that, the matter rests again with the board. Oh, thank you, Jill. Public hearing is closed. Now the matter rests with the board. If a board member would please put forward a positive motion. Greatly appreciate it. Mr. Vig, thank you. And a quick reminder in reference to those department recommendations on page 7, the change that we had there. So if you could please state your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the matter of case number 2011-124, I move that we grant the variance from AMC 2140-045G1 to allow a two-car garage to encroach 1.3 feet into the 20-foot front yard setback, and a variance from AMC 2145-030B to allow a 100-square-foot greenhouse approximately 3 feet from a house and deck, subject to the 4 conditions on page 7 of the staff packet, with the exception of changing the name of the surveyor to Robert E. Johns, Jr. and Associates, and the date to 9/16/11.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Dunham, did you second that motion?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Mr. Vig, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you. I having difficulty with standards 1 and 2, to be honest with you. I believe that the applicant presented some information that I think is worth considering as far as the condition of the land when it was developed, as far as it having some drainage issues. I'd be interested to hear other board members' opinions on standards 1 and 2, but standard number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed, and special conditions and circumstances are not the result of actions of the applicant. I think it's clear that the garage encroachment resulted from actions of the applicant, but perhaps are more to do with a misunderstanding with the permitting process, and I think that deserves some extenuating consideration of that of that fact. I could see that that could be substantially met, and with regard to the greenhouse, not requiring a building permit for that type of structure, it doesn't appear to be the kind of structure that could be located really too many other places. So it was probably an oversight, but I don't see a compelling reason to find that that's not substantially met as well. Standard number 4, I believe that, and I agree with staff's analysis of standard number 4, I don't believe that granting either variance would adversely affect the use of adjacent property. So I believe that that standard is met. And standard number 5, that the variance is in keeping with the intent of the code and will not change the character of the zoning district. I agree with staff's analysis and with regard to the garage and the greenhouse variance. And standard number 6, I agree that the standard is met for the garage, that it would not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the people of the municipality of Anchorage. And I think that the fire department or fire plan review comments with regard to the fact that the greenhouse is an accessory structure, it's not regulated, and they did not have a code path objecting to the greenhouse is enough of a reason for me to believe that this standard is met for the greenhouse as well. And standard number 7, that it's the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. I believe it is, as staff mentioned, I believe it is met for the garage. A 1.3 foot encroachment, I think, is a minimum situation. And the fact that the greenhouse has a 3-foot clearance that around the deck in the house that the fire department has no objection to, I think is a minimum variance situation that I would believe supports meeting the standard for the greenhouse as well, and standard number 7. So I'm interested to hear other thoughts on standards 1 and 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Dunham, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I plan to support this motion, and the reason I plan to support it is because I think all the conditions have been met to grant the variance. And I'll talk about 1 and 2, but I'd like to talk about some of the others as well. I believe there are exceptional and extraordinary physical circumstances subject to this property. They're not applicable to other land in the area. We heard the petitioner's representative talk about a water condition that was resolved with the building of the new garage and the new parking area. And I believe that by itself is probably sufficient enough to support the finding that condition number 1 is met. Condition number 2, physical circumstances. Strict application of this code would create an exceptional or undue hardship on the property owner and would deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties under the same district. Petitioner's representative mentioned that this was a property that did not have a garage prior to this addition. And I know in previous years we made a rule, there was an informal assumption that garages were a reasonable structure to add to a property, and that covered parking is more or less essential in Alaska here. But I think the other thing that we need to realize too is that if we require a foot and a half off of, or a foot and 1.3 feet off of this garage, we probably compromise the garage itself and require a significant alteration to the building. And I think that is an undue hardship for as de minimis setback as this is. And I really believe that the greenhouse, both for Condition 1 and Condition 2, is really a minimal variance. When I look at the as-built, I don't see a conforming location for that greenhouse other than in the front yard, and I wouldn't want to have it there, and I'm sure the neighbors wouldn't want to have it there. So I really think that the greenhouse, along with the garage, meet the conditions for a variance. And I do believe that, it's the minimum variance that would be required to make reasonable use of the land.
Thank you, Mr. Dunham. Would any other board member like to speak to the motion? Ms. Williams.
Thank you. I do intend to support the motion for the garage, mostly because it is so de minimis. This would have been administratively granted had it been 0.9 feet, so we're talking about less than half an inch here. So for that reason, I intend to support the motion for the garage. I am having a bit of trouble with the greenhouse variance but because of Standard 7. And am struggling with whether granting that variance is really the minimum variance that will make possible reasonable use of the land. Especially, and I know we judge cases on a case-by-case basis, but in the last case we just heard, we had talked about a reasonable use of the land being having a home. So I'm just kind of having trouble reconciling those two. So I'm interested to see if any of the board members have thoughts on Standard 7.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Fink?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'd like to concur with Mr. Dunham's comments and direct response on the greenhouse issue. Ms. Williams, I mean, it seems to me that is the only reasonable place to put the greenhouse. I mean, the neighbors don't want it in the front yard. I mean, though they could put it there. But I think the concept of a reasonable use incorporates getting along with your neighbors and aesthetically pleasing. I mean, this really is to me, I see the greenhouse behind the house as a pretty de minimis variance and a pretty minimum request. So I guess I'm not having the heartburn with the greenhouse, and I'm not as eloquent as Mr. Dunham was in explaining his reasoning on that, but I guess I would concur with him. I don't think the neighbors would be happy if it were moved behind them or on the sides of them, and it doesn't seem to create a fire issue, which is the purpose of the code. So given that, I think it's a minimum variance as far as the use of the land for the greenhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Mr. Kars.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I intend to support the motion as well for the reasons that have been mentioned by Mr. Vague, Mr. Dunham, and Ms. Williams as well. Again, echoing that her statement that each of these cases stands on its own merits, but going along the discussion of what we heard on the previous case and then this case with respect to Standard 7, I kind of echo Mr. Fink in that I think the other case, it was a minimum. I mean, we were dealing with something that was visually observed by adjacent property owners and affecting them. I don't see that the separation issue of the greenhouse is in that same category. This is really more of a fire safety issue that the fire department has indicated is not a hazard. So for that reason, I find that standard 7 is met. I'd also just like to quickly add, with regard to the garage itself and standards 1 and 2, per page 18 of the packet, I believe this is the applicant's submittal. The house was built in 1975, which predates zoning regulations, and that at that time the house location was established. As Mr. Dunham has indicated, this board has found that garages are a right, and in an Arctic environment offer a number of benefits for parking and safety. So the opportunity for placement of the garage was kind of established in 1975, and I don't think that the garage that's constructed is overly large, so I think those conditions weigh on my finding that those standards 1 and 2 are met, and I intend to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Cars. I intend to support the motion as well for the reasons discussed and mentioned by both Mr. Dunham and Mr. Cars regarding garages in Alaska. Although I haven't been here quite 10 years, I still can't get over the fact that not more people use the garage as a garage in Alaska. But I'm not a sourdough yet, so maybe when I am, I'll understand. Any other discussion on the motion? Okay. With that, let's vote. The motion passes with 8 yes votes, 8 positive votes. I shall read for the record, every final decision of the board shall clearly state on its face it is a final decision with respect to all issues involved in the case, and that the parties have 30 days from the date of mailing or other distribution of the decision to file an appeal to the Superior Court. Thank you. 5 minutes. Okay. All right, looks like we have everyone present and accounted for, so we'll proceed with case number 3 for the evening. Is Petitioner Richard Moore present? If so, please indicate there. Okay, good evening. Mr. Barrett, I believe this is your case. If you could please provide sufficiency of notice.
It is my case, Mr. Chairman, but Miss Inglis is going to practice on you.
Ah, very good.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the board. My name is Jillian Inglis, and my last name is spelled I-N-G-L-I-S. On October 19, 2011, 127 public notices were mailed. The North Mountain View Community Council was notified. We did not receive a comment back from the Community Council. We did receive one letter in opposition to this variance.
Thank you, Ms. Inglis. Please proceed with the presentation when you're ready.
In the packet, this case involves a building permit and issuance of certificates of occupancies. In the packet, you'll find the plot plan on page 3 and 31, the as-built survey on page 4 and 32, the certificate of occupancy on page 39, photos on page 40 and 41, and the neighbor comment on page 28. This is a request for a variance from Anchorage Municipal Code 2140-050G to allow for an encroachment into the required western side yard setback of approximately 1.5 feet and have a setback of 3.5 feet instead of the required 5 feet. The property is zoned R3, multiple family residential district. It is a legal non-conforming lot. It was platted prior to zoning, and the lot is only 2,875 square feet. Therefore, the required setbacks are 20 feet adjacent to Thompson Avenue. East and west side property lines are 5 feet, and the rear property lines are 5 feet. The house was built after platting and after the R3 zoning. Like I've said earlier, it's a legal non-conforming lot, and the lot is approximately one-half the size of the other lots in the subdivision. When the building permit application was made in 2009, it is for a new house. The plot plan indicated that the house would be 3.5 feet from the property line. The plan reviewer noted it at the time, and we do not know who may have changed it on the plot plan, but it was indicated that the house would be 5 feet from that western side yard setback. The house was constructed, and then the as-built survey came in. The building department issued a certificate of occupancy on the property, and it was noted that the house is actually only 3.5 feet from the property line instead of the required 5 foot. The builder constructed the house per the plot plan. We believe that the builder did not receive the corrected plot plan at the time he was constructing it. As for the findings, finding number 1, exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances, we believe that this standard is substantially met. The lot is less than one-half the legal size of the R3 property. It was platted prior to the R3 standards and were established in the area. As to finding number 2, physical circumstances, the strict application of this code would create an exceptional or undue hardship upon the property owner. This standard is partially met. The builder was not notified to correct the setback at the time of construction. The building was constructed. Had the house been shifted 1.5 feet to the east, it would have been in compliance. However, since this lot is an extremely small lot, the standard is partially met. The hardship is not self-imposed. The standard is partially met. There is an unusual physical condition in that the lot is a small size and is the result of the 1965 plat. The need for the variance does appear to be the result of the actions of the applicants or professionals who were representing them at the time. 62409 as-built plot plan indicated that the house, as it now exists, could have been built at the legal setbacks had it been shifted. The municipality made an error in 2011 when we issued the certificate of occupancy. However, the variance would have still been required regardless of the error when we issued the certificate of occupancy. As to standard 4, if granted, if the variance is granted, will not adversely affect the use of the adjacent property as permitted under the code. This standard is substantially met. The 2 adjacent lots have houses on them. There is no structure separation violation. The fire department does not oppose or object to this. The drainage and runoff do not appear to be an issue. The encroachment is 1.5 feet into the required 5-foot side yard setback. There is one letter of objection that I noted earlier. However, they're referencing the alleyway. The setback adjacent to that eastern property line on the alley is in compliance. There is not a violation there. As to standard 5, if the variance is granted, is it keeping with the intent of the code? This standard is substantially met. The request for the variance is dimensional and is not a use variance. The setback reduction does not change the character of the zoning district. As to standard 6, if the variance is granted, does it adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the people of the municipality of Anchorage? This standard is substantially met. As noted in standard 4, the fire department does not object to this variance. As to standard 7, the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. There's adequate lot area to build the house that they wanted to build. However, the encroachment is not unreasonable. To meet the 5-foot setback at this point would require major alteration or moving of the house. Therefore, AMC 2115-010B requires that all 7 standards are substantially met in order for the variance to be granted. The department finds that standards 2 and 3 are only partially met and does not recommend approval. However, as all of the other yard setbacks are met and the encroachment is only 1.5 feet, the department does not object to this application, subject to the conditions 1 through 3 of the packet on page 9.
Thank you, Ms. Inglis. Do any board members have questions for staff? I do have a question, Ms. Inglis. The plot plan surveyed on page 3 of the staff packet has what appears to be a diagonal with X's through it. Is that in reference to a clear vision triangle, or what purpose, if you know, does that serve?
I'm going to assume, I can't recreate what they may have marked that up for. I'm going to assume that it does indicate or imply that they're looking at a clear vision triangle. Technically, the clear vision does not apply in that corner of the property because it is an alleyway.
Thank you. Just to confirm, though, is primary access to the property from that alley?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. That's the extent of my questions. Any others from board members? No? Seeing none? Thank you very much, Ms. Inglis.
Thank you.
If the petitioner would please come forward. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Richard Moore, M-O-O-R-E.
Good evening, Mr. Moore. You'll have 10 minutes for your presentation. Go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. As the lady mentioned, this is a very small lot, non-conforming lot. It's only 22,875 feet, which, you know, average lot is nowadays is 7,000, 6,000. So it's a very small lot. Because the lot was so small, I had the house designed to fit the setbacks exactly. And I even had the footing corners marked by the land surveyor before we started building the house. Then after the footings were done, I had him come back and stake the corners where the actual stem wall goes up to make sure it's in the setbacks. And then after that was done, I had him come back again and make sure that we were still within all of our setbacks before I had the structure built, to make sure, you know, because I knew it was close. But part of the issue is that the proposed plot plan was drawn on, and I never saw that. The surveyor never saw that. It was done, I don't know where it was done or how it was done, but it was approved after someone had handwritten on the legal document, which is his stamp, but he was never told that someone had changed his document. So that's where this problem came from mostly, is because the document was changed and he was never told someone changed your document. You can't change documents. So that's what brought all this about. But the lot's very small, and changing the house would be impossible. All of the plumbing, I'm sorry, I'm on to question 3. The lot is very small. Changing anything, that side of the house is the plumbing. So, and the kitchen is up there. All the kitchen cabinets are up there. So in order to take that 1.5 feet off the house, you're basically destroying the entire kitchen just to even try, and that's just, you know, it's a bearing wall. And it's quite an ordeal to remove 1.5 feet off of a house, you know. And if this is granted, it won't affect any of my neighbors, because on the one side that we're out of compliance, there's an old house there already. Been sitting there for, I don't know, 50s, you know, a very old house. There's already a fence on the property that I assume that house put up, and I'm, you know, a few feet, I'm like 8 or 9 feet away from that fence, and there's quite a distance between the two houses, so it's, you know, you have a good fire lane there, and on all their sides it's either a street or an alley, so you can get to all the neighbors. So that doesn't, you know, that's plenty of room there. It won't change anything in the neighborhood. You know, that's a very mixed neighborhood. You've got Next door to me, on the other side of the alley, is a 9-plex. Across the street is a 4-plex. Across the street is a church, and across the street is a park, and then there's houses. Very mixed neighborhood. So having another small house there, it's not affecting anything. I've talked with the neighbors, and so far nobody's had any complaints. They were just happy that someone's building a nice house in what used to be an old, lot where kids would play and get hurt in. Now there's a house, and people are going to be living there. And all I'm asking is that you just let the house remain as it sits. Like I said, it's not affecting anybody adversely. And this was not discovered until I was supposed to close on the house. Same thing, the title company is what brought the attention. Something's wrong, the papers don't match. And up until that point, I'd never seen the hand scribbled where the surveyor wrote 3.5 feet. And then I never saw, I saw the 5 feet, but I never saw the handwritten portion, which, like I said, it's a legal document. You're not supposed to handwrite things on and then let people proceed. So I don't know who changed that or how it got changed, but, that's one of the big deals to me is, it should have been stopped in the beginning. It should have never been allowed to proceed. But since it was allowed to get all the way to closing, and then, someone bring up, hey, what's wrong with this house? That's kind of like I said, I took extra steps to make sure it went where it belonged. And no one ever bothered to, say, oh, you missed this, or surveyor should catch that, So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Board members have any questions for petitioner? Okay, seeing none. Ms. Inglis, does staff have any questions for Mr. Moore?
No, we don't.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Moore. If you have a seat, we'll open the hearing up for public testimony. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify in this case? Okay. Seeing no one. Okay. Any final comments from staff?
No.
Okay. Any questions from the board?
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
It's quite all right. Okay. With that, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing. Missing everything tonight, aren't I? Mr. Moore, you do have about 4.5 minutes left if there's anything you wanted to rebut or discuss. But if not, okay. Thanks. Don't want to leave any time on the table, do we? All right. With that, the matter rests with the board. If I could please ask a board member to put forward a positive motion in this case. Mr. Kars, thank you. Please state your motion.
Before I make my motion, Mr. Dunham, was I too quick on the draw there? Okay. All right. Yes, in with respect to case number 2011-125, I move that we grant a variance from AMC 2140-050G to allow a structure to encroach into the required side yard. Bear with me, is that side yard, front yard setback? I believe it's the side yard setback.
Mr. Barrett, do you want to, or would staff like to clarify?
Apologies, Mr. Chairman. It's the side yard. When I wrote it, I was on another planet. Thank you. Side yard.
Mr. Baird, that was your opportunity to blame Ms. Inglis, but I appreciate you taking the higher ground there.
Admirable.
Yeah. Structure to encroach into the required side yard setback by approximately 1.5 feet and have a setback of 3.5 feet instead of the required 5 feet, subject to conditions 1, 2, and 3 on page 9 of the staff packet.
Thank you, Mr. Kars. Mr. Dunham, did you second that motion?
Yes, I did.
Not quite a first, but almost.
Well, no, it's all right.
Mr. Kars, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I intend to support this motion. concurring with the findings of staff that standard 1 is met, is substantially met. The lot is less than half the legal size for an R3 property. Standard 2, again, because of the extremely small size of the lot, I find staff has found this standard to be partially met, and I concur, would also feel that that's more than partially met. With respect to standard 3, I find that this standard is met. I appreciated the comment from the applicant that the surveyors staked the foundation multiple times. So the intent was to put this in the proper location. It was not a matter of negligence on the part of the owner or surveyor, I do not believe. Further, I'd note that shifting the house east to get it out of the setback on the west side would actually make would shift the house closer to the alley, which is the location of the driveway. So a 20-foot alley is fairly narrow, and it could be closer than it is presently. However, I think shifting that house west and slightly into this into this setback, is a little bit of a benefit to the already small lot. So I find that standard 3 is met. Standard 4, I do find this standard is met, weighing my decision with staff's comments that the fire department has not objected to this request. Standard 5 and 6 are substantially met, as well as standard 7. So for those reasons, I intend to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Cars. Mr. Dunham, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I concur with Mr. Carr's findings and those of staff, and would add to that, that, again, adding on to what Mr. Carr said about shifting the building to the closer to the alley, I think would actually create some turning and maneuvering issues for the applicant getting in and out of that garage. So I intend to support the variance.
Thank you, Mr. Dunham. Any other board member comments? Okay. Seeing none, please vote. The motion passes with 8 positive votes. I will read for the record, every final decision of the board shall clearly state on its face it is a final decision with respect to all issues involved in the case, and the parties have 30 days from the date of mailing or other distribution of the decision to file an appeal to the Superior Court. Thank you. Have a good evening. All right. Agenda item I, reports. Don't believe we have any chairman, secretary, or committee reports. Board member comments? Seeing none, I'll offer up my own just briefly. I'm open to any constructive criticism other board members have as to my performance as chair. I do have just 4 months left and would definitely like to improve performance. Either on the record or off the record, those comments would be welcome.
I just note that I think chops might be give you a little bit more intimidating look. If you want to expand on those.
Mr. Carls, I'll take that into consideration and ask my wife about that. Mr. Barrett, how are things looking for next month, and any update on board member reappointments?
No updates, Mr. Ron, Mr. Chairman. How about an update on the baby status?
37 weeks as of yesterday, so things are healthy, and hopefully the baby won't arrive for another couple of weeks. But I'll be sure to let folks know, especially if it precludes my presence next month.
4 cases scheduled for next month, December 8th. Get a preliminary head count. Does anyone know they will not be here? Okay, excellent. Title 21 is cranking along. Chair Osiander hopes to have it approved by the Assembly in the summer, and we'll be looking at a whole new way of dealing with variances. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Anything else? All right, meeting adjourned.